I never knew I had a great-uncle Arthur. To be completely honest, I didn't know much about my father's side of the family at all. They were nothing more than shadows to me, distant echoes of a rugged past that my parents had deliberately left behind in the dense, suffocating foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, surrounded by concrete, manicured lawns, and the constant, reassuring hum of city life. The wilderness was something I only experienced through television screens or the occasional, heavily sanitized camping trip. So, when I received a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the return address of a law firm I had never heard of, my first assumption was that it was some kind of elaborate scam. I was barely making rent on my cramped apartment, my freelance graphic design business was hemorrhaging clients, and my bank account was a constant source of profound anxiety. The idea that a deceased relative had singled me out as his sole heir felt like a cruel joke drafted by the universe. But the letter was real, the law firm was real, and the dusty, mahogany-paneled office I found myself sitting in 3 days later was very, very real. Mr. Sterling, the estate attorney handling my uncle's affairs, looked exactly like the kind of man who dealt exclusively with dead people's secrets. He was a thin, frail-looking man with skin the color of old parchment and eyes that seemed to constantly evaluate my worth. He sat across from me behind a massive oak desk, carefully adjusting a pair of reading glasses on the bridge of his narrow nose. "Your great-uncle Arthur was a deeply private man, Mr. Vance," Mr. Sterling began, his voice dry and devoid of any emotional inflection. "He lived a solitary life on his property in Blackwood Ridge, primarily concerning himself with his, canine companions." "Canine companions?" I repeated, leaning forward in the stiff leather armchair. "You mean he ran a dog farm?" Mr. Sterling offered a tight, non-committal smile. "You could call it that, yes. A breeding facility, perhaps, though he rarely sold any of his stock in his later years. The estate consists of a large Victorian-style farmhouse, several acres of heavily forested land, and the outdoor kennels. It has been fully appraised, and a very eager buyer, a commercial logging company, has already made a substantial cash offer for the land." My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs. A substantial cash offer. Those words echoed in my mind like a chorus of angels. This could be my way out of debt, my way to finally start breathing again without the crushing weight of financial ruin pressing down on my chest. "That sounds incredible, Mr. Sterling," I said, trying desperately to keep the sheer desperation out of my voice. "Where do I sign to authorize the sale?" Mr. Sterling sighed, a slow, whistling sound that seemed to stir the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the blinds. "It is not quite that simple, I'm afraid." He opened a leather-bound folder on his desk and carefully withdrew a single sheet of heavy paper. "Your uncle included a highly specific stipulation in his last will and testament regarding the transfer of the deed. Before you can legally inherit the property and subsequently sell it, you are required to spend 1 full week on the estate. 7 consecutive nights." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the bizarre condition. 7 nights? I asked, genuine confusion knitting my brows together. "Why? What could possibly be the point of that?" "Arthur believed that the land required a transition of authority, so to speak," Mr. Sterling replied carefully, avoiding my gaze. "He insisted that the new owner must familiarize themselves with the property, the isolation, and the animals before they earned the right to dispose of it. If you fail to remain on the property for the full 7 days, the estate will be donated to a state conservation trust, and you will receive absolutely nothing." I leaned back in the chair, running a hand nervously through my hair. A week in a remote mountain cabin. It didn't sound terrible, really. If anything, a week away from the noise of the city, disconnected from the constant pinging of my email and the dread of incoming bills, might actually do me some good. I could bring my laptop, catch up on some reading, and enjoy the fresh mountain air. It was a minor inconvenience for a life-changing payout. "Fine," I said, nodding decisively. "I'll do it. When do I leave?" Mr. Sterling finally looked up, and for a fleeting second, I thought I saw a flicker of profound pity in his pale, watery eyes. The arrangements have already been made, Mr. Vance. The keys are in this envelope, along with detailed coordinates. I strongly advise you to purchase all the provisions you will need before you begin your ascent up the mountain. Blackwood Ridge is entirely off the grid, and once you are up there, you will be utterly alone. 2 days later, my battered old SUV was packed to the brim with groceries, bottled water, a stack of unread paperback novels, and enough firewood to survive a small ice age. The drive out of the city and through the sprawling Midwestern plains was easy and monotonous. But as the hours bled into one another, the landscape began to undergo a dramatic and unsettling transformation. The flat, open horizons were slowly swallowed by rolling hills, which eventually jagged upward to become towering, ancient mountains. The multi-lane highways narrowed into cracked, 2-lane state routes, and eventually, the pavement gave way entirely to a deeply rutted gravel road that seemed to spiral endlessly upward into the dense, dark timber. The trees here were not the friendly, manicured oaks of my suburban childhood. These were massive, towering pines and twisted, skeletal hemlocks that grew so close together their branches intertwined, forming a thick, nearly impenetrable canopy that completely blocked out the afternoon sun. It was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but beneath the trees, it felt like the dead of twilight. My GPS signal died abruptly about 20 miles back, the bright blue line on the digital map vanishing into a gray void. I was navigating strictly by the printed directions Mr. Sterling had provided, tracking my mileage on the dashboard. The silence outside the car was heavy and absolute, broken only by the aggressive crunching of my tires crushing loose stones. I hadn't seen another vehicle, a house, or even a power line for nearly an hour. I finally spotted a dilapidated, rusted sign marking the last outpost of civilization, a solitary, run-down gas station that looked like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the early 80s. I pulled up to the single, ancient pump, deciding to top off my tank just in case. As I stepped out of the vehicle, the sudden chill in the mountain air hit me like a physical blow. An old man emerged from the shadowy interior of the small convenience store, wearing a faded plaid jacket and a deeply suspicious scowl. He didn't say a word as he watched me pump the gas, his eyes lingering on my out-of-state license plates. "Beautiful country up here," I offered, trying to break the uncomfortable tension. "I'm heading up to the old Thorn estate. Blackwood Ridge. Do you know it?" The old man froze, his gnarled hand pausing halfway to his pocket. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable moment, his expression unreadable beneath the shadow of his grimy baseball cap. "Arthur Thorne's place," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Yeah, that's right," I replied, offering a polite but strained smile. "He was my great-uncle. I'm just heading up to clear out the house." The man spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the cracked asphalt. "You best turn around, city boy. Ain't nothing up on that ridge but rot and bad memories. Them dogs of his, they ain't right." I chuckled, assuming he was just trying to spook an outsider. "I've got dog food in the trunk. I'm sure we'll get along fine." The old man didn't smile. He didn't even blink. "They don't eat dog food," he muttered, turning his back on me and shuffling back into the dim interior of the store. "And they sure as hell don't act like dogs." A cold shiver raced down my spine, but I quickly brushed it off as the harmless rambling of an eccentric mountain hermit. I paid for the gas at the pump, climbed back into the driver's seat, and locked the doors, feeling an undeniable wave of relief as I put the station in my rearview mirror. The final 5 miles were agonizingly slow. The gravel road degraded into little more than a muddy, washed-out logging trail, forcing me to crawl at a painfully slow pace to avoid tearing the undercarriage out of my SUV. The woods grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and a creeping sense of profound isolation began to settle heavily in my stomach. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a massive set of wrought iron gates standing defiantly in the middle of the wilderness. The metal was heavily rusted, consumed by aggressively creeping ivy, and chained shut with a heavy brass padlock. I put the car in park, grabbed the heavy ring of keys Mr. Sterling had given me, and stepped out into the biting mountain air. The lock yielded with a loud, protesting screech, and I pushed the heavy iron gates open, wincing as the hinges wailed into the dead silence of the forest. I drove through, tires crunching on overgrown weeds, and rounded a sharp bend in the driveway. And there it was. The Shadow Estate. The house was a sprawling, multi-story Victorian monstrosity that looked entirely out of place in the rugged mountain landscape. Its dark, gray paint was peeling off in long, dead strips, the wraparound porch was sagging under the weight of decades of neglect, and the tall, narrow windows stared back at me like hollow, sightless eyes. The entire structure seemed to lean slightly, as if exhausted by its own existence, anchored to the earth only by the thick, thorny vines that crawled up its wooden siding. But the house wasn't what immediately commanded my attention. It was the kennels. Stretching out behind the house, sprawling toward the tree line, was a massive complex of chain-link fences and concrete runs. It was far larger than I had anticipated, capable of housing dozens, perhaps hundreds, of animals. I killed the engine, the sudden absence of the motor's hum leaving a ringing vacuum in my ears. I stepped out of the vehicle, my boots crunching loudly on the dead leaves littering the yard. I waited for the inevitable explosion of noise. Any dog owner knows that the arrival of a strange vehicle, the slamming of a car door, or the scent of an unfamiliar human is enough to set off a chorus of frantic barking. In a kennel this size, the noise should have been deafening. It should have echoed off the mountainsides and shattered the peaceful silence of the woods. But there was nothing. Absolute, suffocating silence. I frowned, pulling my jacket tighter around my shoulders, and began to walk cautiously toward the chain-link enclosures. Perhaps my uncle had already sold them. Perhaps the kennels were empty. But as I drew closer, the shadows within the wire cages began to shift and solidify. They were there. Dozens of them. There were German shepherds, massive Rottweilers, sleek Dobermans, and countless unidentifiable mixed breeds with thick coats and muscular frames. Every single pen was occupied. I approached the nearest fence, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. "Hey," I called out softly, clicking my tongue against my teeth. "Hey there, pups." Not a single tail wagged. Not a single low growl rumbled in a throat. Not a single paw scratched against the concrete. Instead, every single dog in the compound was standing perfectly still, as rigid as statues carved from dark stone. They weren't looking at me. They weren't looking at my car. Every single head, from the closest pen to the furthest run, was turned precisely in the exact same direction. They were all staring deeply into the thick, dark woods at the western edge of the property. Their ears were pinned back flat against their skulls, the hackles on their backs raised into stiff, aggressive ridges. Their bodies were coiled tight with an invisible, agonizing tension, trembling ever so slightly as they stared into the trees. I followed their collective gaze, squinting into the gloom beneath the pine canopy. I expected to see a bear, perhaps a mountain lion, or maybe just a wandering deer. But there was absolutely nothing there. Just the dark, twisting trunks of the ancient trees, fading into a solid wall of blackness as the afternoon sun finally dipped behind the ridge. I took a step closer to the fence, my breath catching in my throat. I watched the nearest dog, a massive, Blackwood shepherd mix. The animal wasn't breathing heavily. It wasn't panting. It was just staring, its dark, intelligent eyes locked onto that empty patch of forest with a look of absolute, paralytic terror. The old man's words from the gas station suddenly echoed in the freezing mountain air around me. "They sure as hell don't act like dogs." A cold gust of wind swept down from the ridge, rattling the chain-link fences and whistling mournfully through the peeling eaves of the old house. The sun disappeared completely, plunging the estate into a deep, oppressive twilight. I had to spend 7 nights here. Looking out at the silent, staring pack, and the darkening woods they watched so intensely, one terrifying thought crossed my mind. 7 nights suddenly felt like an eternity. Chapter 2, The Perimeter. The process of unloading my car was one of the most agonizing experiences of my life. Every time I walked from the open trunk of my SUV to the sagging front porch of the Victorian house, I could feel the invisible weight of 100 unblinking eyes pressing into the back of my neck. The dog still hadn't made a single sound. There was no scratching against the concrete, no rattling of the chain-link fences, and absolutely no vocalization whatsoever. It was a terrifying, unnatural paralysis that completely defied every instinct I knew animals possessed. I tried to ignore them, focusing intensely on the cardboard boxes of non-perishable food, the heavy jugs of filtered water, and the duffel bag containing my clothes. But my peripheral vision constantly betrayed me, drawing my attention back to the massive kennels behind the house. Even as the deep purple twilight began to completely swallow the estate, replacing the fading daylight with heavy, impenetrable shadows, their posture remained utterly unchanged. They were still locked in that rigid, agonizing stance, staring deeply into the black void of the western tree line. I fumbled with the heavy brass keys Mr. Sterling had given me, my fingers numb from the rapidly dropping mountain temperature. The deadbolt on the heavy oak front door was stiff with rust and disuse, requiring me to throw my entire shoulder against the wood to finally force the mechanism to turn. The door swung inward with a prolonged, agonizing groan that echoed loudly through the cavernous interior of the house. I stepped over the threshold, immediately assaulted by the thick, stagnant air trapped inside the old structure. It smelled like dry rot, old leather, damp earth, and something faint but distinctly metallic lying just beneath the surface. I reached out, running my hand along the peeling wallpaper until my fingers brushed against a cold brass light switch. I flipped it upward, holding my breath and silently praying that the estate's private generator was still functional. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a low, vibrating hum that seemed to originate from the very foundation of the house, a series of dim, yellowed bulbs flickered to life in the grand foyer. The light was weak and anemic, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor that stretched toward the back of the house like grasping fingers. I dragged the last of my supplies inside, firmly kicking the heavy front door shut behind me and throwing the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. I leaned against the solid wood, closing my eyes and exhaling a long, shaky breath. Just 7 days, I muttered aloud to the empty hallway, finding a strange, pathetic comfort in the sound of my own voice. 168 hours. You can do this. Think of the payout. I opened my eyes and began to take a proper inventory of my great-uncle's sanctuary. The house was a sprawling maze of narrow corridors, high ceilings, and heavily draped windows that blocked out any remaining slivers of moonlight. The furniture was entirely antique, draped in thick layers of undisturbed gray dust that billowed into the air with every step I took. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal mementos on the mantelpieces, and no signs of warmth or human affection anywhere to be found. It was less of a home and more of a meticulously preserved mausoleum. I navigated through a massive, formal dining room and pushed through a swinging wooden door to find the kitchen. It was surprisingly functional, equipped with a heavy cast-iron stove, a deep porcelain sink, and a refrigerator that hummed with a loud, aggressive mechanical rattle. I quickly unpacked my groceries, organizing the cans of soup and boxes of pasta into the empty pantry cupboards, desperate for a mundane task to anchor my racing mind. Once the food was stored away, I grabbed a heavy iron flashlight from my duffel bag and decided to secure the rest of the ground floor before trying to sleep. The living room was situated at the rear of the house, directly overlooking the massive complex of outdoor kennels. It was dominated by a colossal stone fireplace and surrounded by towering, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves crammed with decaying, leather-bound volumes. In the center of the room sat a massive leather armchair, its surface worn smooth and cracked from years of heavy use. It faced a large bay window, providing a perfect, unobstructed view of the back property and the terrifyingly silent dog runs. I approached the glass cautiously, shining my flashlight out into the heavy mountain darkness. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the chain-link fences and the concrete floors of the pens. They were still there. The dogs hadn't moved a single inch since I had first arrived hours ago. The sweeping beam of my flashlight passed directly over their faces, reflecting sharply in their wide, unblinking eyes, but they completely ignored the sudden burst of light. Their collective attention remained entirely consumed by the invisible void in the western woods. I quickly killed the flashlight, unable to stomach the sight of their unnatural, statue-like paralysis for another second. I pulled the heavy velvet drapes completely shut, sealing off the view of the kennels and plunging the living room back into the dim, yellow glow of the overhead lamps. I decided against exploring the upstairs bedrooms. The thought of sleeping in a strange, dusty bed, isolated on the second floor of a creaking, unfamiliar mansion, sent a wave of icy nausea washing over my stomach. Instead, I dragged my sleeping bag out of my duffel and unfurled it directly onto the large, faded Persian rug in the center of the living room floor. I built a small, crackling fire in the massive stone hearth using the dry wood I had brought from the city, hoping the heat and the flickering orange light would chase away the encroaching dread. I ate a cold, flavorless sandwich for dinner, sitting cross-legged on my sleeping bag and staring blindly into the dancing flames. The silence of the house was absolute and deeply oppressive. In the city, silence is never truly silent. There is always the distant hum of traffic, the muffled thud of a neighbor's footsteps, or the rhythmic pulsing of a distant siren. But here, on Blackwood Ridge, the silence was a physical, crushing entity that pressed aggressively against my eardrums. It felt as though the entire mountain was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to finally happen. Exhaustion eventually overpowered my severe anxiety, and I crawled fully clothed into my sleeping bag, pulling the heavy fabric all the way up to my chin. I don't know exactly what time I finally drifted off to sleep, but I know precisely what woke me up. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. My eyes snapped open in the pitch-black room, the fire having completely burned down to nothing but faintly glowing orange embers. The air in the living room had grown freezing cold, thick enough that I could see the faint white plumes of my own rapid breathing. But that wasn't what had violently pulled me from my sleep. It was a vibration. A deep, rhythmic, almost imperceptible tremor traveling directly through the wooden floorboards beneath my sleeping bag. Thud. 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 It was incredibly slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. I lay perfectly still, my muscles locking up as a rush of pure, primal adrenaline flooded my bloodstream. The vibration wasn't coming from inside the house. It was coming from outside. It was moving slowly along the exterior wall of the living room, passing just inches away from the heavy brick foundation. I strained my ears, desperately trying to listen over the deafening, frantic hammering of my own heart. There were no footsteps. There was no crunching of dead leaves, no snapping of dry twigs, no sound of breathing. There was only the heavy, rhythmic displacement of weight, pressing down into the earth with terrifying, methodical purpose. Thud. 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 The vibration slowly migrated past the living room wall, moving steadily toward the front of the house, before eventually fading away into the absolute stillness of the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my back pressed firmly against the heavy stone of the cold fireplace, my hands gripping my flashlight like a weapon. I waited for the vibration to return, flinching at every minor creak and groan the old house made as the temperature continued to plummet. When the first weak, gray rays of morning light finally began to filter through the gaps in the heavy velvet drapes, I practically wept with relief. I threw off the sleeping bag, my body stiff and aching from the cold and the unrelenting tension. I needed to know what had circled the house. I needed a rational explanation, something I could anchor my deteriorating sanity to. Perhaps it was just a massive black bear foraging for food, or a strange seismic anomaly unique to this part of the mountain range. I grabbed my thick winter coat, slipped my boots on, and unlocked the heavy front door, stepping out into the freezing, foggy morning air. The fog was thick and gray, clinging aggressively to the tall pines and rolling across the overgrown lawn in slow, swirling waves. I immediately looked toward the kennels. The dogs were exactly as I had left them the night before. Standing. Staring. Silent. It was as if time had completely frozen for them, trapping them in an endless loop of paralyzing dread. I tore my eyes away from the haunting sight and began to walk cautiously around the perimeter of the sprawling Victorian house. I kept my eyes glued to the ground, searching the damp soil and dead leaves for large animal prints or signs of disturbed earth. I reached the side of the house, near the living room wall where I had felt the terrifying vibrations during the night. I stopped dead in my tracks. There were no paw prints. There were no boot tracks. Instead, exactly 4 feet away from the exterior wall of the house, there was a trench. It was a deep, smooth groove carved aggressively into the hard-packed mountain dirt, roughly 2 feet wide and nearly a foot deep. It didn't look dug, it looked worn. The earth inside the trench was compacted so tightly that not a single blade of grass or creeping weed managed to grow within its boundaries. I crouched down, hovering my hand over the dark, packed soil, feeling an inexplicable chill radiating upward from the disturbed earth. I stood back up and began to follow the trench, walking slowly as it traced the exact perimeter of the enormous house. It followed the sharp angles of the foundation perfectly, turning precisely at the corners and maintaining the exact same 4-foot distance from the walls. It ran past the kitchen, swept around the massive wraparound front porch, and curved smoothly past the heavy iron gates of the driveway. I followed it all the way around, my breathing growing shallow and erratic as the impossible reality of the situation began to set in. The trench formed a perfect, unbroken circle completely surrounding the estate. It wasn't a natural formation, and it certainly wasn't a landscaping feature implemented by my eccentric great-uncle. This was a path. A path worn deep into the stone and soil by years, perhaps decades, of unrelenting, continuous pacing. Whatever had made this trench was massive, impossibly heavy, and completely relentless. And based on the sheer depth of the compacted earth and the absolute lack of any organic growth within the groove. It never stopped walking. It just circled the house. Over and over and over again, night after night, year after year, patiently waiting just beyond the threshold. I stood frozen at the edge of the circle, looking back toward the silent kennels. The dogs weren't staring at the woods to look for a predator. They were staring at the exact point in the tree line where the circular path finally broke away from the house and vanished into the impenetrable darkness of the forest. They were watching the entrance. They were watching the exact spot where whatever walked the circle would eventually emerge when the sun finally went down again. I pulled my coat tighter around my trembling body, a sickening wave of absolute terror washing over me. "I have to get out of here," I whispered into the freezing fog. But the keys to my SUV were resting on the kitchen counter. And to get back to the front door, I would have to step across the trench. I would have to step into its path. Chapter 3, The Intangible Theft. Stepping over the trench felt like crossing an invisible boundary between the world of the living and something entirely else. I hovered my booted foot over the perfectly compacted earth, staring down into the smooth, dead groove that encircled my great-uncle's prison. A wave of irrational, paralyzing vertigo washed over me. It was as if the trench was not merely a depression in the soil, but a bottomless chasm threatening to swallow me whole. I squeezed my eyes shut, holding my breath, and forced my weight forward. My boot hit the dead, frost-covered grass on the side closest to the house. I didn't pause to look back. I sprinted up the rotting wooden steps of the wraparound porch, my heavy boots hammering a frantic, echoing rhythm against the silence of the mountain morning. I grabbed the frozen brass handle of the front door, practically ripping it open, and threw myself into the suffocating, dusty darkness of the grand foyer. I slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me, immediately throwing the deadbolt, sliding the chain lock into place, and leaning my entire body weight against the thick wood. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, dragging in deep, ragged breaths of the stale, metallic-smelling air trapped inside the house. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs, beating with such ferocious intensity that I could feel the pulse throbbing painfully in my teeth. "I am leaving," I whispered aloud, the sound of my own voice trembling violently in the empty, cavernous hallway. "I don't care about the inheritance. I don't care about the money. I am leaving right now." The memory of Mr. Sterling's dry, emotionless voice suddenly echoed in the back of my panicked mind. If you fail to remain on the property for the full 7 days, the estate will be donated to a state conservation trust, and you will receive absolutely nothing. For a fleeting second, the crushing reality of my suffocating debt tried to anchor me to the floorboards. The overdue notices, the threatening voicemails from collections agencies, the absolute certainty of eviction waiting for me back in Chicago. But then I remembered the horrific, agonizing vibration I had felt through the floor the previous night. I remembered the impossibly deep, circular track worn into the unforgiving earth. And I remembered the terrifying, unnatural paralysis of those dogs, standing like living statues, waiting for whatever paced the perimeter to finally emerge from the woods. No amount of money in the world could make me spend a second night in this house. I pushed myself away from the front door and moved rapidly toward the living room. I grabbed my heavy duffel bag from the floor, not bothering to fold my sleeping bag or gather the paperback books I had scattered near the fireplace. I carelessly shoved my laptop into the side pocket, zipping the canvas shut with a harsh, aggressive rip that sounded incredibly loud in the dead silence. I slung the heavy strap over my shoulder, grabbed my iron flashlight, and walked purposefully toward the swinging wooden door that led to the kitchen. When I had unpacked my groceries the night before, I had deliberately placed my keys in a very specific, undeniable location. I had dropped them directly in the center of the large, circular mahogany table that dominated the breakfast nook. I remember the sharp, distinct clatter the heavy metal ring had made against the polished wood. I pushed through the swinging door, my eyes immediately locking onto the center of the table. The table was completely empty. I stopped dead in my tracks, my brain struggling to process the visual information. I blinked once, twice, expecting the heavy ring of keys to suddenly materialize from thin air. The polished mahogany surface remained perfectly bare, reflecting the dim, gray morning light filtering through the dirty kitchen window. A cold, prickly sensation began to crawl up the back of my neck, spreading slowly across my scalp. "No," I muttered, my voice barely more than a breath. "No, no, no. I put them right there." I dropped my heavy duffel bag onto the linoleum floor, the dull thud echoing mockingly in the tight space. I walked slowly to the table, running my trembling hand over the smooth, dust-free circle where the keys should have been resting. There was no logical reason for them to be missing. I lived alone in this massive, decaying tomb. The front door had been locked. The windows were all heavily latched and painted shut from decades of neglect. I immediately began to rationalize, my desperate mind grasping wildly at any plausible, mundane explanation. I was exhausted. I was sleep-deprived, terrified, and operating on pure, unfiltered adrenaline. I must have absent-mindedly moved them when I was storing the canned goods in the pantry cupboards. I turned to the dark, narrow pantry and pulled the wooden door open, sweeping my flashlight beam across the neat rows of soup cans and pasta boxes. Nothing. I systematically began to search the kitchen countertops, moving the heavy ceramic sugar bowls, lifting the ancient, cast-iron skillet resting on the stove, and checking inside the deep porcelain sink. I opened every single drawer, frantically pushing aside rusted cutlery, frayed dish towels, and decades-old instruction manuals for appliances that no longer existed. My movements, initially methodical, rapidly deteriorated into a frantic, chaotic frenzy. I was tearing the kitchen apart. I dropped to my hands and knees, shining the harsh beam of the flashlight under the heavy oak cabinets, praying they had simply slid off the table and kicked under the trim. There were only thick, gray dust bunnies and a few dead, curled-up spiders. Panic, cold and sharp as a jagged piece of ice, finally pierced through my forced rationalization. I pushed myself off the floor, my breathing growing fast and shallow, bordering on hyperventilation. I left the kitchen and practically ran back into the living room. Perhaps I had carried them in here last night. Perhaps I had set them on the stone mantelpiece above the fireplace when I was building the fire. I swept the flashlight across the dusty stone, illuminating nothing but a heavy layer of undisturbed soot and a tarnished brass clock. I dropped to my knees again, violently tearing my sleeping bag apart, shaking the heavy fabric out over the Persian rug. I unzipped my duffel bag, dumping all of my neatly packed clothes, my laptop, and my toiletries into a chaotic pile on the floor. I searched the pockets of my jeans, the pockets of my thick winter coat, even the small, hidden compartments inside my backpack. The keys were gone. They hadn't just been misplaced, they had been entirely erased from the environment. I stood in the center of the destroyed living room, my chest heaving, my hands buried deep in my hair as a feeling of absolute, trapped helplessness washed over me. Without those keys, my SUV was nothing more than a 2-ton paperweight sitting in the overgrown driveway. Without those keys, the rusted iron gates at the edge of the property would remain locked forever. Without those keys, I was stranded 20 miles away from the nearest paved road, isolated in a dead zone with zero cellular reception. A sudden, horrifying thought struck me with the force of a physical blow. If I hadn't moved the keys? And if they hadn't simply fallen? Then someone, or something, else had taken them. The thought paralyzed me. I slowly raised my head, my eyes wide and terrified, scanning the dim, shadowy corners of the massive living room. The house suddenly felt infinitely larger, darker, and deeply hostile. Every shadow stretching across the peeling wallpaper looked like a crouching figure. Every creak of the settling foundation sounded like a stealthy footstep on the floorboards above my head. I had refused to go upstairs yesterday. The second floor had remained completely unexplored, a black, terrifying void hovering directly above me all night. I swallowed hard, tasting bile in the back of my throat, and forced myself to walk toward the grand, curving staircase in the foyer. I gripped my heavy iron flashlight like a club, my knuckles turning completely white from the strain. I placed my foot on the first wooden step. It let out a prolonged, agonizing shriek that echoed violently through the silent house. I froze, waiting for a response from the darkness above. Nothing. I slowly ascended the stairs, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm in my ears, the air growing noticeably colder with every step I took. The second floor landing was a long, narrow hallway lined with closed, heavy wooden doors. The dust up here was incredibly thick, coating the faded runner rug like a layer of fresh, gray snow. I pointed my flashlight at the floor, inspecting the undisturbed dust. There were no footprints. Not a single mark marred the perfect, velvety blanket of decay. Nobody had walked down this hallway in years, perhaps decades. I spent the next 2 hours systematically forcing open every single door on the second floor. I searched the guest bedrooms, ripping heavy sheets off ancient mattresses and tearing through empty, mothball-scented wardrobes. I searched what must have been my great-uncle Arthur's master suite, a room that smelled overwhelmingly of medicinal ointment and old, dried leather. I checked beneath the heavy 4-poster bed, behind the towering oak dresser, and inside the rusted clawfoot bathtub in the adjoining bathroom. I found decades of hoarded newspapers, boxes of dried-out fountain pens, and stacks of cryptic, hand-drawn maps of the surrounding mountains. But I did not find my car keys. Eventually, I descended back to the first floor, entirely defeated and thoroughly terrified. The house was empty. But the keys were completely gone. I walked numbly to the kitchen and dropped a heavy, cast-iron skillet back onto the gas stove. My mind was a chaotic, swirling mess of pure survival instinct and agonizing logic. I looked at the heavy deadbolt on the kitchen's back door. It was still engaged. It hadn't been picked or forced open. The chain lock on the front door was equally secure. How did they get into my house? I slowly raised my head, my eyes drawn toward the small window above the porcelain sink. The morning fog was finally beginning to burn off the mountaintop, allowing thin, gray shafts of sunlight to pierce through the thick canopy of ancient pine trees. I looked past the overgrown, weed-choked lawn toward the massive complex of chain-link kennels. The dogs. They hadn't moved an inch since I had first arrived nearly 24 hours ago. Every single animal, from the massive Rottweilers to the lean Dobermans, was still standing perfectly still. Their dark, unblinking eyes were locked in a horrific, agonizing stare, focused entirely on the empty void in the western tree line. It was as if an invisible thread connected the dogs to that specific point in the dark forest. A cold dread washed over my entire body as a sickening realization bloomed in my terrified mind. I remembered the old man at the rundown gas station, his gnarled hand pausing halfway to his pocket, his expression unreadable beneath the grimy baseball cap. They sure as hell don't act like dogs. I leaned closer to the dirty glass, pressing my face entirely against the cold windowpane. I followed the collective gaze of the silent, paralyzed pack. My eyes tracked the invisible line, sweeping past the rusted metal of the kennels and past the edge of the circular, worn trench. My eyes stopped on a single, massive oak tree standing just at the edge of the dense pine forest. It was incredibly tall, its thick, twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. I squinted hard, desperate to pierce the deep shadows lingering beneath its heavy canopy. And then, my heart completely stopped in my chest. Hanging delicately from the very end of a low, thick branch, swaying ever so slightly in the freezing mountain wind. There was a sharp, distinct glint of silver metal. I grabbed a pair of heavy, tarnished brass binoculars I had found earlier on a dusty bookshelf in the living room. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely focus the twin lenses against the dirty window glass. I zoomed in tightly, the image blurring wildly before suddenly snapping into agonizing, crystal-clear focus. The breath completely left my lungs in a harsh, involuntary gasp. I lowered the heavy binoculars slowly, letting them hang heavily from the leather strap around my neck. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a random piece of rusted tin left behind by my eccentric relative. Hanging from that exact branch, precisely at the center of the dog's terrifying, unbroken gaze, was the heavy ring of keys I had placed on the mahogany table just hours before. They were impossibly far away from the locked house. They were hanging directly over the invisible entrance point of the circular trench. And to get them back, I would have to walk into the woods. I would have to cross the perimeter. Chapter 4, The Tipping Point. Time lost all meaning as I stood paralyzed at the kitchen window, staring through the tarnished brass binoculars. The heavy silver ring dangling from the lowest branch of the ancient oak tree was a profound, undeniable violation of reality. My keys had been resting securely on the mahogany table just hours ago, separated from the outside world by solid oak doors and rusted deadbolts. Now, they were suspended exactly at the focal point of the massive, silent pack of dogs. They were hanging directly above the exact spot where the circular, barren trench vanished into the impenetrable darkness of the Appalachian forest. It was a lure. It was a perfectly calculated, maliciously placed piece of bait. Whatever haunted the perimeter of this decaying estate wasn't a mindless animal operating on pure instinct. It possessed a terrifying, predatory intelligence. It knew I was inside the house. It knew I was terrified. And most importantly, it knew exactly what I needed to escape. I slowly lowered the binoculars, the heavy leather strap biting sharply into the back of my sweating neck. The grandfather clock in the grand foyer suddenly chimed, a hollow, mournful, metallic sound that violently shattered the oppressive silence of the house. 4 o'clock. My eyes darted frantically toward the pale, gray sky visible above the jagged tree line. The afternoon sun was already beginning its rapid, merciless descent behind the towering ridges of the mountains. In this deep, isolated valley, twilight did not arrive slowly. Once the sun dipped below the peaks, the shadows would lengthen with terrifying speed, plunging the entire estate into absolute, suffocating darkness within a matter of minutes. A cold, sickening wave of nausea twisted violently in my stomach. If I waited until nightfall to retrieve those keys, I would never make it back to the house alive. I remembered the impossibly heavy, rhythmic vibration that had shaken the floorboards beneath my sleeping bag the night before. Thud. 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 The entity that walked the trench did so exclusively under the cover of darkness. I had a window of perhaps 45 minutes before the sun completely vanished. It was a horrifying ultimatum. Stay inside the locked house, survive the night, but remain completely trapped on the estate without a vehicle. Or step outside, crossed the massive, overgrown yard, breached the invisible perimeter, and retrieved the only means of my salvation before the sun went down. "Think, Elias, think," I whispered to myself, pressing the palms of my trembling hands fiercely against my closed eyes. I forced myself to breathe, inhaling the stale, metallic air of the kitchen in sharp, ragged gasps. The promised inheritance money was a distant, laughable memory now. Mr. Sterling's dry voice, the imposing mahogany office, the threat of financial ruin waiting for me back in Chicago, none of it mattered anymore. This was no longer a matter of paying off my crushing debts. This was an incredibly raw, primal fight for basic survival. I pushed myself away from the cold porcelain sink and began to move with a frantic, desperate purpose. If I was going out there, I was not going out completely empty-handed. I practically ran back into the living room, my boots thudding loudly against the dusty hardwood floors. I approached the massive stone fireplace, my eyes scanning the heavily rusted iron tools resting on the hearth. I bypassed the broom and the ash shovel, wrapping my trembling fingers tightly around the heavy, wrought iron fire poker. It was nearly 3 feet long, incredibly heavy, and tapered to a wicked, sharp point at the end. It was a pathetic, almost comical weapon against an unknown, invisible entity that could manipulate physical objects and terrify a pack of massive guard dogs into total paralysis. But the cold weight of the iron in my grip offered a tiny, microscopic sliver of psychological comfort. I grabbed my heavy iron flashlight from the floor, clicking the switch to ensure the batteries were still strong. The bright white beam cut sharply through the dim, dusty air of the living room. I zipped my thick winter coat all the way up to my chin, pulled a heavy wool beanie tightly over my ears, and shoved a pair of leather work gloves onto my sweating hands. I was as ready as I was ever going to be. I walked slowly down the long, cavernous hallway, my boots echoing like gunshots against the rotting floorboards. I stopped in front of the massive oak front door. My hand hovered over the heavy brass deadbolt. My brain was screaming at me to stop, begging me to retreat to the center of the house, to hide beneath a bed and pray for morning. But I gritted my teeth, violently ignoring the primal survival instincts tearing at my sanity. I grabbed the deadbolt, twisting it sharply to the left. The lock yielded with a loud, protesting screech. I undid the brass chain lock, letting it drop against the wood with a sharp clatter. I pulled the heavy door open, wincing as the rusted hinges wailed into the dead silence of the afternoon. The freezing mountain air hit me immediately, stinging my cheeks and carrying the damp, rotting scent of decaying pine needles. I stepped out onto the sagging wraparound porch. The world outside the house was completely, devastatingly silent. There were no birds chirping in the dense canopy above. There were no insects buzzing in the tall, dying grass. There was only the chilling, empty void of an environment holding its breath. I descended the rotting wooden steps, my eyes immediately locking onto the circular, barren trench carved into the earth. I stepped over it quickly, refusing to look down into the smooth, compacted dirt. Once I crossed the perimeter and entered the sprawling, overgrown backyard, the full, crushing weight of isolation hit me. I was completely exposed. I began to walk toward the chain-link kennels, my iron fire poker gripped so tightly my knuckles ached through the thick leather gloves. The distance from the back porch to the tree lean was perhaps 100 yards. Under normal circumstances, it was a 30-second walk. Today, it felt like crossing a vast, endless desert of pure terror. As I drew closer to the sprawling complex of cages, the sheer scale of the anomaly became horrifyingly clear. There were at least 50 dogs housed in the concrete runs. Massive, muscular beasts bred entirely for aggression and territorial defense. And every single one of them was standing as rigid as a taxidermy display. I walked slowly along the edge of the chain-link fence, the metal wire just inches from my shoulder. I could smell them now. It was a sharp, overwhelming stench of damp fur, old urine, and a distinct, sour odor that I instantly recognized as pure, unfiltered animal panic. I stopped next to a pen housing a colossal, heavily scarred Rottweiler. The dog was massive, its thick black coat marred by old, pale scars, indicating a violent, aggressive history. Its massive jaws were clamped shut, its muscles trembling so violently under the skin that the entire animal seemed to vibrate. Its dark eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely consumed by the void in the western woods. "Hey," I whispered, my voice cracking pathetically in the freezing air. The Rottweiler did not flinch. Its ear did not twitch. It was trapped in an invisible, agonizing prison of sheer dread, completely unaware of my presence just feet away. I looked past the Rottweiler, scanning the dozens of other dogs lining the fence. They were all identical in their posture. They were an army of living statues, forced to bear witness to something I could not yet comprehend. I tore my eyes away from the horrifying spectacle and focused on the ancient oak tree standing at the edge of the property. The sun was now resting directly on top of the western ridge. The sky was bleeding from a pale gray into a deep, bruised purple, casting long, distorted shadows across the dead grass. I had mere minutes left. I tightened my grip on the fire poker and broke into a fast, determined jog. The dry, dead leaves crunched violently beneath my heavy boots, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the absolute silence. I reached the final boundary of the yard. Here, the circular, barren trench broke away from its perfect orbit around the Victorian house. It veered sharply toward the tree line, cutting a deep, dark path directly under the massive branches of the ancient oak tree. And there, dangling perfectly above the center of the compacted dirt path, were my car keys. They hung from a thin, nearly invisible piece of decaying twine tied to a low-hanging branch. They were swaying gently in a cold breeze that I could not physically feel on my own skin. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from the trench. The temperature here was dramatically, undeniably different. It was at least 10 degrees colder at the edge of the woods than it was near the house. The air felt heavy, damp, and charged with a strange, static energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end beneath my heavy coat. I looked deeply into the impenetrable darkness of the dense pine forest. The trees grew so close together here that the shadows formed a solid, unyielding wall of blackness. Whatever had walked the circle, whatever had hung my keys from this branch, was in there. Chapter 5, The Warden's Path. The vibration traveling through the heavy rubber soles of my boots was no longer a distant, theoretical threat. It was a violent, rhythmic earthquake localized entirely within the 2-foot width of the compacted dirt trench. Thud. 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 It was marching relentlessly out of the dense, impenetrable blackness of the pine forest. And it was moving directly toward the exact spot where I was currently standing. A primal, screaming terror completely short-circuited higher reasoning in my brain. I didn't think about the inheritance money, the suffocating debt waiting for me in Chicago, or the bizarre legal stipulations of my great-uncle's will. I only thought about the 50 massive, aggressive predators currently baring their teeth at me from the rusted chain-link kennels. Their collective, guttural growl vibrated intensely in the freezing evening air, a sound of pure, unfiltered, territorial hatred. They weren't growling at the woods anymore. They were growling at me. By stepping into the circular trench, by physically entering the barren path worn into the earth, I had triggered something deeply unnatural. I had inadvertently become the target of their profound, paralyzing dread. For one brief, horrifying second, I understood why the dogs had been staring at the edge of the woods all day. They weren't waiting for a monster to emerge from the darkness to attack the estate. They were waiting for the warden to begin its nightly patrol. And by standing in its path, my scent had suddenly merged with the overwhelming aura of whatever ancient, heavy thing dragged itself around the house every single night. The thudding in the earth grew agonizingly close. It felt as though a massive, invisible freight train was bearing down on me from the shadows beneath the ancient oak tree. The heavy iron fire poker suddenly felt completely useless in my trembling, gloved hand. I let it drop. It hit the dead, frost-covered grass with a dull, heavy thud. My fingers clamped desperately around the freezing metal of my car keys, the jagged edges biting sharply into my palm through the leather. I ripped my boots out of the compacted dirt of the trench as if the soil itself had suddenly caught fire. The moment my feet left the smooth groove and hit the overgrown weeds of the sprawling backyard, the terrifying auditory hallucination completely vanished. The 50 dogs in the kennel snapped their jaws shut simultaneously. The aggressive, deafening chorus of low growls was instantly silenced, replaced by the crushing, absolute quiet of the mountain evening. I didn't pause to analyze the sudden shift in their behavior. I didn't dare to look over my shoulder into the suffocating darkness of the tree line. I simply ran. I sprinted across the dead, uneven yard with an explosive burst of pure, unadulterated adrenaline, my breath tearing loudly through my burning throat. The massive, decaying Victorian house loomed ahead of me like a giant, rotting tombstone against the deep purple night sky. I bypassed the sagging wraparound porch entirely, sprinting directly toward the overgrown gravel driveway where my rusted SUV was parked. The temperature had plummeted drastically in the 3 minutes since the sun had vanished behind the ridge. A thick, unnatural layer of white frost was already beginning to aggressively crystallize across the windshield of my vehicle. I slammed my body against the driver's side door, my trembling hands fumbling wildly with the heavy cluster of keys. I dropped them. The heavy metal ring hit the frozen gravel with a sharp, sickening clatter that echoed violently into the dead silence of the forest. No, 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 I sobbed out loud, a pathetic, terrified sound that I barely recognized as my own voice. I dropped to my knees on the sharp stones, frantically sweeping my gloved hands over the frozen ground in the pitch black. My fingers brushed against the icy metal, and I snatched them up, scrambling back to my feet with bruised, aching knees. I jammed the key blindly into the lock, twisting it so hard I thought the old metal might snap completely off inside the mechanism. The heavy door popped open with a loud click. I threw myself into the driver's seat, instantly pulling the heavy door shut behind me and slamming my hand down onto the power lock button. The 4 mechanical locks engaged simultaneously with a sharp, reassuring thud that momentarily anchored my spiraling sanity. I was inside. I was separated from the mountain air by a thick layer of steel and glass. But the crushing sense of profound danger did not dissipate. It intensified. I shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it forward with absolute desperation. The engine whined. It let out a high-pitched, mechanical screech, grinding lazily as the freezing mountain temperature fought against the old, tired battery. It choked, sputtered, and died completely. Silence flooded the cabin of the SUV, heavy and absolute. I closed my eyes, a hot tear of pure frustration and terror leaking down my freezing cheek. "Please," I whispered into the dark, empty cabin. "Please, just start. Just get me out of here." Before I could turn the key a second time, a sound echoed through the night that made my blood run entirely cold. It wasn't the dogs. It was the sound of heavy, deliberate movement. The rhythmic, terrifying vibration I had felt through the floorboards of the living room the night before was no longer muffled by the foundation of the house. Thud. 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 It was incredibly loud out here. It sounded like wet, heavy sandbags being repeatedly dropped onto solid concrete from a terrible height. And it was moving directly across the front lawn, following the precise curve of the barren, circular trench. I slowly opened my eyes, my breath pluming in thick white clouds against the freezing glass of the windshield. I reached out with a trembling hand and twisted the headlight knob on the steering column. The twin beams of my high-intensity headlights suddenly sliced through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the overgrown yard and the front of the Victorian house in stark, blinding white light. The beam completely illuminated the section of the trench that curved past the front porch. There was nothing physically there. No giant bear. No twisted mountain cryptid. No deranged, violent human being pacing the perimeter. But the air above the trench was completely, horrifyingly wrong. It was heavily distorted, warping and rippling like the intense heat waves rising off a boiling asphalt highway in the dead of summer. The distortion was massive, towering nearly 8 feet into the air, completely blurring the peeling gray paint of the house behind it. It possessed an undeniable, terrifying mass. The frost-covered grass directly on either side of the trench flattened completely as the invisible distortion moved past, crushed flat by an immense, unseen gravitational pressure. I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the rippling void methodically traced the circle. Thud. 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 It was pacing. It was performing an endless, relentless guard duty, bound perfectly to the path worn into the earth by decades of eternal walking. It didn't look toward my car. It didn't acknowledge the blinding, harsh light illuminating its invisible, crushing form. It simply continued its slow, agonizing march around the perimeter of my great-uncle's prison. I violently twisted the ignition key again, pumping my foot aggressively down onto the gas pedal. The engine whined, choked, and suddenly roared to life with a deafening, beautiful mechanical explosion. I didn't wait for the engine to warm up. I threw the heavy gear shift down into drive, my tires spinning wildly in the frozen gravel before finally catching traction. The SUV lurched violently forward, tearing down the long, winding driveway toward the massive wrought iron gates at the edge of the property. I had left the heavy padlock open when I arrived yesterday. I didn't even tap the brakes as I approached. The heavy front bumper of my vehicle slammed aggressively into the rusted iron, bursting the gates wide open with a massive, screeching crash of bending metal. I fishtailed wildly onto the muddy, deeply rutted logging trail, the steering wheel fighting violently against my grip as I accelerated down the dark mountain. I drove with a reckless, suicidal intensity. I ignored the deep potholes that threatened to tear the suspension entirely out from under the car. I ignored the sharp, skeletal branches of the pine trees that aggressively whipped and scraped against the passenger side windows. I didn't slow down until I finally reached the bottom of the long, winding descent, nearly an hour later. The tires hit smooth, blessed asphalt, and the thick, suffocating canopy of the forest finally gave way to the wide, open sky. I kept driving for another 2 hours. I didn't stop until I reached a brightly lit, generic chain motel located directly off the interstate, entirely surrounded by concrete, bright neon signs, and the comforting hum of passing semi-trucks. I paid for the room in cash, locked the thin wooden door behind me, dragged the heavy dresser entirely across the carpet to block the entrance, and collapsed onto the cheap, scratchy bedspread. I didn't sleep a single minute. I lay perfectly still in the sterile, brightly lit room, staring blindly at the popcorn ceiling, listening intently to the distant rumble of the highway. I waited for the floorboards to vibrate. I waited for the heavy, rhythmic thudding to find me. But nothing came. When the sun finally rose, casting a pale, weak light through the cheap motel blinds, I sat up, grabbed my cell phone, and dialed a number I had memorized from the cream-colored envelope. The phone rang 3 times before it was picked up. Law Office of Sterling and Vance. This is Mr. Sterling speaking. His dry, emotionless voice sounded incredibly alien after the horrors of the mountain. It's Elias Vance, I rasped, my voice raw and completely devoid of any remaining energy. I'm done. I left the property. I'm relinquishing all claims to the estate. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I expected him to sound disappointed. I expected him to lecture me about the massive financial loss, or the strict legal stipulations of the will. Instead, when he finally spoke, his voice held a profound, chilling note of quiet relief. I understand completely, Mr. Vance. I have already begun the necessary paperwork to transfer the deed to the State Conservation Trust, as requested by your late great-uncle. A sudden, dark realization crept slowly into the back of my exhausted mind. I remembered the massive, rippling distortion of gravity pacing the perimeter. I remembered the profound, instinctual terror radiating from the 50 guard dogs trapped in the kennels. Mr. Sterling, I said softly, my grip tightening aggressively on the plastic casing of the phone. What exactly is on that property? What was my uncle doing up there for all those years? Another long pause stretched across the cellular connection. I could hear the faint, dry rustle of heavy paper being shuffled across a mahogany desk in Chicago. Your great-uncle Arthur was a deeply committed man, Elias. He understood the absolute necessity of containment. The dogs were not there to guard the house from intruders. The dogs were there to ensure that whatever walks the perimeter never, ever loses its focus. A cold dread washed over me, completely freezing the blood in my veins. "What do you mean?" I demanded, my voice cracking wildly. "What does it focus on?" "The path, Mr. Vance," the lawyer replied smoothly, his tone entirely devoid of human empathy. "The entity is a guardian, bound by blood and soil to circle the property for eternity. But a guardian must have something to guard. If the house remains empty for too long, if there is no soul residing within the center of the circle to anchor its purpose." He let the sentence hang in the air, a terrifying implication completely dripping from the unspoken words. Arthur needed a replacement. He needed someone of his bloodline to endure the isolation, to sit within the circle, and to keep the entity marching. "You were meant to be the new anchor, Elias. You were meant to stay inside the house." I felt the room begin to spin violently. The walls of the cheap motel seemed to aggressively close in on me, compressing the air in my lungs until I was gasping for breath. "But I left," I whispered into the receiver. "I left the circle. I drove away. What happens now?" Mr. Sterling sighed, a slow, whistling sound that echoed through the phone like dry wind moving through dead, skeletal branches. "Now, the estate goes to the Public Conservation Trust. The gates will be removed. The property will be opened up for hiking trails, camping grounds, and recreational use. Dozens of people will walk up that mountain every single week. Dozens of people will set up their tents, entirely unaware of the barren, circular trench hiding in the grass." He paused, and for the first time, I heard a sickening, distinct sound in his dry voice. A smile. "The entity will never lack for an anchor again, Mr. Vance. It will have an endless supply of replacements. Your great-uncle Arthur would have considered it a highly efficient solution. Have a safe drive back to Chicago, Elias." The line clicked softly, followed by the steady, hollow drone of a dead dial tone. I lowered the phone slowly, staring blankly at the ugly, patterned carpet of the motel floor. I was safe. I was hundreds of miles away from the dense, suffocating foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. But as I sat there in the blinding morning light, listening to the roar of the interstate, I closed my eyes and realized a terrifying truth. The silence of my mind would never be truly silent again. Because somewhere in the deep, impenetrable blackness of the mountain timber, a rippling, heavy distortion of gravity was still marching endlessly in a circle. Thud. 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 Patiently waiting for the next camper to step over the trench and enter the shadow estate.